Hello, everyone, and welcome to Deck Tech. I'm Ian Duke. With me is Hall of Famer Frank Karsten. And Frank has brought with him a deck today that he's calling Zoo, which is a term that we're not used to hearing applied to standard decks. It's more of a modern term, isn't it? So without further ado, let's jump right into the first set of cards, and Frank, you can tell us all about how you came to this deck. Looks like we have a series of powerful one-drops here. Often we've seen decks having to choose between, am I going to be base red and play with Inventor's Apprentice, or am I going to be base white and play with Toolcraft Exemplar? You've chosen to include both of those as well as Thraben Inspector. Tell us about how you came to this conclusion.
Yeah, so for this Pro Tour, well, first of all, I knew that I just wanted to play some kind of synergy-driven aggro deck because I enjoy the sequencing decisions, the combat math, the proactive game plan that comes with it. So I tested, indeed, the red-white vehicles deck, the red-black artifact aggro deck, and they were okay, but I felt that they lacked some early game presence, and I didn't want to choose between Toolcraft Exemplar and Inventor's Apprentice. I just wanted to play both in order to get on board early and beat, for example, the Eitherwork Marvel decks before they have time to set up. So as for the name, yeah, I've just been calling it Mardu Zoo informally in testing. It's just that Inventor's Apprentice does such a good card ape impression, and Toolcraft Exemplar is reminiscent of Wildnacadle. So that's where the name
makes a lot of sense. I've actually heard the nickname Nerd Ape used for Inventor's Apprentice,
Yeah.
which I like a lot. So that makes a ton of sense. Just a lot of consistency, very often starting the game with a one-drop. Love it. Let's take a look at what we have next. So here's kind of a slew of other creatures, assorted creatures here. I see that you're not as heavy on the dwarves as some of the other red-white vehicles decks. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so when I have Inventor's Apprentice and Toolcraft Exemplar, I want to make sure that I can turn them on reliably, otherwise they're kind of useless as one-drops. So, well, I wrote an article on Channel Fireball where I did some math on how many artifacts do you need, and I concluded that for a deck with either of those cards, 14 artifacts was a good goal, but obviously the more the better. And when I had both of them in my deck as one-drops, I set the goal of playing, well, at least 18 artifacts in my deck with, well, 15 being able to play them on turn 2 or 3. So that meant that my creature base revolves more around Scrap Heap Scrounger, an artifact, and PNLR, which also brings an artifact with her. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'm filling it up with Veteran Motorist and the Pala, which are just fine cards. I mean, Veteran Motorist, only 3 because I felt that 11 2-drops was enough, but excellent at crewing vehicles and gets me towards my my better cards, or the cards I need. That's why I also have some one-offs in the deck with all the card selection. The Pala didn't always do as much in my testing, often died to a removal spell without providing some value. Also don't have that many drawers to go with her, but as a one-off, I felt she was fine. But yeah, as I mentioned, between Scrap Heap Scrounger, PNLR, and Thraben Inspector, the majority of my creature base is meant to produce an artifact on the battlefield.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You're getting extra artifacts in your deck by having colored cards that produce artifacts. And I like your creature suite a lot. It points to me, it says to me that you're saying, rather than valuing the synergy of like Depala plus vehicles or Depala plus extra dwarves in your deck, you're just playing kind of the independently more powerful cards, which is a traditional hallmark of a Zoo deck.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that I should mention about the Scrap Heap Scrounger is that I'm playing base red-white, but there's just some lands tossed in to allow me to get it back from the graveyard. Not that difficult to introduce some black lands into the mana base. And it's a real nightmare for control decks to play against because it just keeps coming back.
Yeah, it seems really good against Kozilek's Return as well, and that's just another creature that can leap out of the graveyard. Love it so far. Let's take a look at the next group of cards. Here are our vehicles, and I see you've come dressed for the part as well here.
Exactly. I mean, the Smuggler's Copter is one of the better cards in Standard, and an awesome follow-up to turn 1 Crowd Ape or Wildnacadle. Fleetwheel Cruiser fills out the vehicle slots. It's fairly aggressive and just hits pretty hard. Obviously, the proper way to get in the vehicle is to put on the goggles and then turn them sideways, and then after combat you can take off the goggles again. But well, silliness aside, vehicles are a big part of this deck. Not as big as the real red-white vehicles deck, but they are an artifact. They attack for a bunch, and also with Smuggler's Copter, you get a lot of card selection, so you can get deeper into your deck. Perhaps get some one-offs, or get towards the burn spells to produce some reach and deal the last points of damage.
And speaking of which, let's take a look at what we have next here. Here are some of those burn spells. We have a copy of Incendiary Flow, a Declaration of Stone, and 4x Fiery Temper. Tell us about this suite of spells.
So I wanted to play, let's say, a proactive game plan, not too many cards that only remove creatures. In line with a general aggro philosophy, I want my cards to be able to both deal with opposing creatures and kill the opponent when they're at a low life total. Fiery Temper is excellent for that. It's also a good answer to opposing Smuggler's Copters because it's an instant, and excellent to madness out of my own Smuggler's Copter. Incendiary Flow, kind of a fifth Fiery Temper, but it can also exile, for instance, opposing Scrap Heap Scroungers. And a one-off Declaration in Stone as kind of a hedge against cards like Kalitas or Ishkana in the main deck.
And on the topic of Fiery Temper, how often are you casting this for its madness cost? Is that just like an added bonus that comes up sometimes, or is it more like a 50-50 kind of split?
Probably like a bit lower than 50%, but it is absolutely a relevant bonus, because if you can ever, on turn 3, attack with a Smuggler's Copter and then madness out a Fiery Temper, then you still have mana available to add another 2-drop to the board. And at that point, you often have an insurmountable advantage.
Yeah, it's a huge
tempo-wise.
Tempo swing as well as a card advantage swing, because you're not down a card discarding to the loot from the Copter. Makes a ton of sense. Let's take a look at the next group here, kind of rounding things out. A Key to the City, another card you can use as a madness outlet, I presume, as well as getting through some damage.
Yeah, also pretty important against cards like Ishkana to get in for the last couple of damage when they have lots of blockers on the battlefield. And Gideon, I wanted to have a third 4-drop, given that I had a mana base with 23 lands, and a third Fleetwheel Cruiser felt a bit like too many vehicles. It's a bit dangerous to have too many of them lying around with no creatures to crew them. So to balance all things out, I added a Gideon, which is just a solid card.
Love it. Next up, I think we're getting to the mana base here. Some of the fast lands we have here from Kaladesh. Needle Spires, just 2 copies, a little bit of additional aggression.
Yeah, I didn't want to play 4 Needle Spires because I want to be able to play my 1-drops on turn 1. I kind of had to put in order to get enough colored sources for both red and white. And it's still useful in the late game to have access to it, but I never really want to draw, well, really draw them in my opening hand. I just want untapped lands, and that's why the fast lands are so powerful.
Yeah, they seem phenomenal in this deck, as well as 3 copies of Ether Hub. They'll give you a few extra sources of black mana if you need it.
Yeah, exactly. I can get the Scrap Heap Scrounger back from my graveyard this way, and Ether Hub gives me an untapped white and red source to play my 1-drops early.
Right, and we talked a lot about consistency with the deck, so that makes perfect sense. And then just rounding things out with some basic lands. So the deck looks awesome. How are you doing in Constructed so far?
I'm 5-2 in Constructed with the deck. My draft rounds haven't been going that well, so I'm nowhere near the top of the standings, but I'm having a good time in Standard at least, and enjoying this deck.
Fantastic. The deck looks great. Thanks so much for joining us, Frank. Ian Duke signing off from Deck Tech. Thanks.